Hi, and welcome to this Fortune Brainstorm Health conversation, focusing on thinking beyond the mask, how next generation ideas can spark a revolution in health in partnership with McKinsey. I'm Senior Editor Beth Coet. Thank you for joining us today for this important and timely conversation. In a moment, I'm going to hand things over to Fortune Editor-in-Chief Clifton, who will frame the discussion and introduce our panelists. But first, just a couple of housekeeping items for you all. Today's gathering is on the record and will be covered by a Fortune journalist. We'll be taking audience questions that will be posed to the panelists later in the program. Please use the chat function to submit your questions. We'll be calling on those of you with questions to turn on your microphone and ask the speakers directly. And I'll work with Cliff on surfacing and streamlining the themes that you are interested in hearing more about. And with that, I will hand things over to Cliff.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you all for joining us today. While COVID-19 has delivered devastation, apparently to my voice, excuse me, I hope that's not COVID-19, in the form of hundreds of thousands of deaths worldwide and untold economic loss, it also offers us a moment of great opportunity. The global pandemic is requiring us to reimagine healthcare as we know it, with the fundamental understanding that innovations, some of them quite revolutionary, will be required for long-term success. If I might paraphrase a line from Matt Damon's character in the film The Martian, we're going to have to science our way out of this. And of course, those who've seen the movie know that Matt was a little bit more colorful in his phrasing. So how can we make sure we not just generate scientific discoveries, as we always have, but facilitate the process? And how can we get faster at translating those discoveries and the new understanding into meaningful interventions that actually address not only this pandemic, but global health more generally? In short, how do we unlock breakthrough innovations that can transform the trajectory of health everywhere? I am so pleased to get the chance to dive into these questions with an all-star group of thinkers and leaders who, and I'm not exaggerating here, ponder daily and perhaps obsessively about how to reinvent traditional processes of discovery to make them faster, smarter, and better. This group has been very thoughtful and indeed vocal about how to spark innovation in their various enterprises or fields and how to teach those around them to think outside the box. So with that, let me introduce these wonderful and radical thinkers who will lead our discussion, and all of you as well. When I mention your name, if you could, please just give us a wave so our audience knows who you are. First, it's Michael Chui, partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey and Company, who's dialing in from San Francisco. Dr. Trevor Bedford, Associate Professor of Vaccine and Infectious Disease Division at the Hutch, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in Seattle. Dr. Michelle McMurry-Heath, who's President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization in Washington, D.C. And Regina Dugan, the CEO of Wellcome Leap, the innovation arm of the Wellcome Trust, and she's calling from Los Angeles. And in a minute, or very soon, we're going to have Paul Stoffels join us. He's the Vice Chairman of the Executive Committee and the Chief Scientific Officer at Johnson & Johnson, who I believe may be calling in from Belgium. So, with that, I'd actually love to begin with you, Michael, if we can just have you sort of introduce for us some key framing ideas. I know McKinsey has two big reports out that really have laid the groundwork for innovation in the bio field. So I would love to just get you to summarize those, if you would.
Well, it's about 400 pages worth of work, so you can feel free to download it. I don't know I can summarize anything, but let me just hit a few key points. I think we really are seeing, first of all, you could look at hundreds of years of innovation in biology and in healthcare, but what's interesting now, and I think one of the things that's really interesting is this convergence of all of these biological technologies and information technology. And that applies both in terms of the research and how we're developing new therapies and drugs, but also how it's applied, out there in the real world. And so when you do see this convergence, I'm trained as a computer scientist, and I'm a big fan of this idea of Moore's law, which, arguably is slowing down, but, that's why this mobile device has as much power as a supercomputer, right? It's the power of compounding interest, basically, right? It's every 18 months, say, you get twice as much computing power. But now we're seeing, biological technologies like sequencing, advancing faster than Moore's law. And so if you think about that as a substrate to understand at the, biomolecular level what's going on, and then the ability to, to manipulate, these types of things at the molecular level through techniques like CRISPR. And what's interesting, I had the opportunity to speak with, the co-discoverer of CRISPR, Jennifer Doudna, and I asked her just, as a sort of an offhanded question, what would you advise a college student to study if you had the opportunity to? And I thought she'd say, biochemistry or something like, she's a biochemist, right? Microbiology, something along those lines, virology. And she actually said computer science, artificial intelligence, or robotics. I'm like, what are you talking about? Why in the world is that true? And it's because, she says, look, the cutting edge of biology actually requires all of these tools in order to make that happen. And I think those convergences together are ushering in a set of innovations, both on the healthcare field as well as our research span across, other areas in the economy as well, potentially unlocking 2 to 4 trillion within a decade or two of economic value. And so, we think this is incredibly important, both from the economy standpoint, but clearly from the healthcare standpoint as well.
I was just so hoping she was going to say English or history, but I guess we'll have to settle for coding. Michelle, we were talking earlier about the extraordinary output of the biopharma companies, and you mentioned that there are 180 vaccine candidates now, 9 of which are already in phase 3. And that's kind of an amazing thing when you realize that, we barely understood that there was a virus, 7-8 months ago. So talk a little bit about how your industry has come together really around this idea of collaborative innovation.
Collaboration has been so key, and I'm joined today by Paul Stoffels, who really has led the charge around COVID. So I'd also love to hear Paul's thoughts on this, but we at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization represent over 1,000 companies, large and small, who are in the biopharmaceutical industry, but also in agriculture and the environment and energy. And it's interesting to see how the sectors really galvanized around COVID. So as the pandemic was unfolding, we started a COVID tracker to be able to track all of the scientific progress being made. And Cliff mentioned the vaccine results, but we're up to over 760 total COVID-related development projects underway. So antivirals, therapies, and vaccines. It's been absolutely incredible. And we also set up collaboration hubs as well, so that folks could figure out where they could borrow resources, or where they could collaborate, or where they could join forces to make a difference. So you've seen an unprecedented amount of collaboration between companies, large and small, within various different countries, as well as amazing and important collaboration with government agencies and regulators, as well as nonprofit foundations. So this is just an incredible amount of cooperation, and I hope that it lasts, because we are seeing the results. Now, to date, the fastest vaccine development of any in history, it was 4 years for the mumps vaccine, and we're 8 months into COVID, and our projections are to have vaccines available by the spring of 2021. So it just shows you what we can do when we really come together and are galvanized.
It's really a remarkable story, and Fortune just wrote about this. I interviewed Bill Gates last week, and also Seth Berkley, who's a friend who runs the Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, and both of them were struck by one remarkable type of collaboration, Paul, and that is the fact that in some cases, but the developers of vaccine were being aided in their manufacturing capacity by another company. A company that had nothing to do with developing the vaccine. This is a level of collaboration within the industry we haven't seen, and it really is innovative. And the other aspect of this that's kind of remarkable is the fact that you all, J&J, which has a vaccine pretty far along in the works, also has to deliver a whole host of other drugs and therapies and tools to the rest of the world. You can't just stop manufacturing what you are. And so you've had to rethink that process as well, right, Paul?
Well, it's the breadth and the depth of a company and the 50, 60 years of R&D experience which bring you to being able to do something in 9 months. It's not that you let's get organized and do something in 9 months to get to a vaccine. It's like over the last, let's say, over the last 10 years, we have been working constantly on how can we accelerate new products, and especially the breakthrough cancer therapies, it started with HIV, yeah? With HIV, because we were after life-saving medicines, we had to organize ourselves 24/7, coordinate across the entire organization to get a product developed. Then that was deployed for cancer. Again, we could develop cancer drugs in 2 years, yeah? By working 24/7, coordinating on one big chart every minute, every hour, and get from the start of development to registration. And now we had to do an extreme work, and that also didn't start today. We are working for more than 15 years in the space of platforms for vaccines and for influenza, for RSV, for HIV, for Ebola, for Zika. We have done 4 vaccines into later stage clinical trials, and it trains your organization to be able to do that coordination. But then if you put it in overdrive and you use the capabilities we have got from the mainstream business with the vaccine business, suddenly we were able to get this done in 9 months. And you will see we'll start a phase 3 imminently, and hopefully, also manufacturing is upscaling. We'll bring 1 billion vaccines in the course of next year. And hopefully with everything ongoing, we could have a data endpoint late this year, early next year. But it's a culmination of capabilities, biology, but also data sciences, what was just mentioned. Recruiting the patients now and the people for the studies is completely based on epidemiology, data sciences, where to go for, and it's all helping. The technology, the upscaling technology which we have now is we get like 12 to 15 million vaccines out of a 1,000-liter batch. That is 15 years of research to get that done. And so those are all elements coming together at unfortunately, we can't say at the ideal point. We should never have had this pandemic. And we have been working with Ebola now for more than 10 years. And we saw this coming, whether it was going to be influenza. Some members of our team have been working on SARS in 1995 with an antibody. So we knew already something about this. So it is like, it was in the making. Nobody realized that this was a real threat. We should and could have done much more to be even more ready at the moment. And that's what the future should bring, is like an industry and a world which is ready. Everyone is ready to fight wars, but nobody is ready to fight the wars with the biology. And I think we are ready to do this. The science is there, the capabilities are there, and let's get ready to make this the next wave of innovation we can generate.
Yeah, I mean, a huge part of this is being able to, in order to innovate, you in some ways have to identify the future, not just predict it, but sort of pinpoint what's going to happen. And you have to take a lot of shots on goal for that. Regina, way back when you were running DARPA, sort of famous, research outside the box agency, you actually funded a project on a messenger RNA, using that as a platform for vaccines and for drug development in general. And so, I mean, that is one of the constructs now that we're looking at as possible successful vaccines. And we know a number of companies are trying that. But talk a little bit about what you were thinking 10 years ago when you put a big bet on this.
Yeah. So we were anticipating just this type of event. And of course, the desire there was to have the underpinnings, the technological underpinnings to move quickly to vaccine. So of course, here we've seen unprecedented speed. We went from virus sequence to first dosing in humans in 63 days. Now, of course, there's a lot more work to do. And I think that points not only to those early investments, right, in anticipation of this kind of event, but so much more work to do. So I agree with Paul. I think that the scientific underpinnings are here now. What's so interesting about this moment is that we're seeing biology and engineering converge. Some convergence, as Michael said, also between biology and computer science. But what's so different about this moment is that we also now have a synchronization of our will. So in this respect, it feels very much to me like a Sputnik moment, right? Almost as if the 1918 pandemic and the 29 crash happened on top of each other. What do we do? It's not coincidental that new waves of transformation happen and they grow out of these very difficult situations. So it's my sense that just as we had a new commitment to innovation after Sputnik, this coronavirus could spark not a space age, but a health age. And that's going to require a lot of us, but it is certainly within our capacity to get it done.
Trevor, those are great points. Thank you, Regina. Trevor, Regina just mentioned this convergence of biology and technology. And, you have, really explored that intersection, looking at public health data and trying to use to reinvent that in order to get to make it clear where this SARS-CoV-2 virus was emanating from and where it was spreading, and do it with a speed that we've never seen before. Talk a little bit about how you developed your own data infrastructure and what made it so different, and what we need to do now to reinvent this critical part of our epidemiology and preparedness.
Thanks, Cliff. So I think that you can think about this perhaps just as infectious disease surveillance, and that we need good surveillance systems. And to stop a pandemic, ideally, so there's people in this camp of let's go out into the wild and kind of discover all of the viruses in the world and then figure out which ones are going to get to us next. I'm not in that camp. I think there are too many viruses, and I think it's too hard to figure out what's going on just from a sequence. But if you can catch a cluster very early on, so right after that initial spillover, well, it's still in 2 people, 10 people, before it gets to be hundreds or thousands of people, you can actually quench that outbreak. And so we need surveillance that can very rapidly notice these clusters and then kind of swing public health interventions into line to stop them. What I've devoted most of my academic research to over the last about 10 years is to this field of genomic epidemiology, which used to be molecular epidemiology. And it's basically, let's sequence pathogen genomes, let's sequence virus genomes to look for different mutations that they have. And you'll see kind of along a transmission chain as one person's infecting another person, there'll be mutations to the virus that just happen. They're not good or bad, they just kind of happen because the replication machinery does this. And so we get a mutation on average every 2 weeks, and it can be quite descriptive of what's going on. And that, I think this field has really helped to understand what's going on, especially when you have very little data. So going back to Wuhan in early January, just from initially 5 genomes on January 11th, and then from 20, less than a week later, we're able to say a lot about when the virus emerged in late November 2019 and how rapidly it was spreading just from these 20 different data points, because each genome has kind of so much information there. And I think that was exceptionally helpful. And having the turnarounds get so much better. So if we go back to Ebola in 2015, 2016, or in 2015, we had kind of basically a year from a sample being collected and a sequence being shared to a public database. Whereas early on with SARS-CoV-2, we were hitting kind of 5-day numbers occasionally from different groups. And so it's really getting that sequencing to be cheap enough and just happening readily that has kind of enabled this. I think the sequencing is especially helpful when surveillance is spotty in general, but it can kind of be generally helpful all the time.
And why this is important even more so, I mean, it seems crazy with 200,000 people dead to say that we were lucky, but in some ways we are with SARS-CoV-2 in the sense that it's a relatively stable genome. isn't it? I mean, I got
Mhm.
proceedings, PNAS just had a paper this week talking about how stable the genome is. When you have a virus that evolves even more, that could present a huge problem. You know, and of course, part of our revolutionary thinking in this amazing group is to sort of talk about, you know, as Paul said, the next one, you know, what do we do when, you know, what have we learned in this process to help us get a jump start and even a pre-jump start on preparing for the next one.
Yeah. Cliff, if I might add, I think in this thinking, this never again kind of thinking, which is, I think, important at this moment, I agree with a lot of Trevor's comments that we need to have better surveillance systems. We need to identify a hotspot breakout, but we also need to do more on the response. And these two things, the speed of response, these two things are coupled, right? The earlier we know, the less pressure it puts on our response. The faster our response, the less pressure it puts on our ability to identify. So let's just talk about the vaccine process. And Michelle has talked about the heroic efforts in getting a vaccine. But let's talk about the role of, for example, advances in tissue and organ engineering to speed the part that is recalcitrant and difficult because of safety concerns, and that is the clinical trial itself. So might we imagine advances that currently leverage what we've seen, big advances in tissue and organ engineering, and still much more to do, so that we could accelerate the clinical trial without risking safety? And here, this is important not only for the lives that will be saved, but also for economic damage. If we saved 1 month in the clinical trial, that's 300 billion worth of economic damage avoided, right?
Yeah. It's hugely important point.
It has implications also for equity, which is, I think, important. In tissue and using tissue and organ engineering strategies, we can fully represent the population that we need to vaccinate also, right? So that's important for generalizability, for equity, for all of those things as well. So many things to be done here, but the role of innovation and technology advance is going to be important in our never again strategy, has to be.
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point. When we think about innovation and revolutionary ideas, we tend to think of this sort of science that's being done on the bench. But, you know, Paul and Michelle, you both live in a world where clinical trials, you know, takes up a huge, not only cost for you, but a tremendous time, and it can be agonizing in terms of the regulatory environments and the safety necessities, and of course, all very, very important. But, you know, there is this underrepresentation in clinical trials of Black people, as well as older Americans and others and other groups that aren't represented, that are ultimately going to have these drugs. Are you seeing the same kind of innovative spirit in redeveloping clinical trials as well? Either of you, please jump in and take that.
Well, we're definitely seeing the spirit. It hasn't quite been as effective yet, but I am hopeful that we are now galvanized to really work on it. One of the things that's been really interesting is if you've watched this process unfold, and we at Bio have been really trying to help support our companies as they try to diversify their trials for COVID, because they realize how critically important this is, and we've been putting them in contact with organizations that can help. And you see things like Moderna's announcement a week ago that they were actually slowing down their trial to try to improve the diversity and representation in the trial. But I completely agree with Regina. We need completely new scientific models and paradigms to really modernize how we do clinical trials. And part of this is scientific efforts, like she mentioned, and part of it are information technology efforts as well, using big data, real world evidence, so that regulators can have confidence to pass judgment on a new product and still continue to collect real-time information as it's used in the real world, and then adapt their recommendations if need be on the back end. And that's going to be essential, because what we've seen with Warp Speed is a great partnership between regulators and federal funders and the sponsors, the companies that are developing these new technologies. And that has facilitated amazing speed, but we can go a lot faster if we are as innovative on that end.
Paul, would you just talk a little bit about this challenge of clinical trials, and as particularly for a vaccine when you need to have tens of thousands of volunteers in something like this?
Well, the challenge is that we still need to have entire additional networks next to the healthcare system put up to do clinical trials. Yeah. So the cost, why is it so difficult and why it's so costly, is that we have to put parallel systems up in the healthcare system to test this. We should find much more adequate systems where we could use, and in the UK it's already more possible because you have one data system in the country. You can do clinical trials and you can randomize people in the healthcare system to get to outcome. Yeah, and so getting to faster, simpler type of clinical trials to study in the real world what needs to happen. So the world needs to start, we all need to start thinking. The cost of clinical trials is so huge that most of these vaccines, which are necessary for these diseases, will never happen because of the cost. Yeah. But there's something much more important, very important, I think. I'm in this field now for many years. And so who in the world is still talking about Ebola? Yeah. While it was the crisis a few years ago, the thing dropped dead. We are still working on continuing to finish our Ebola files. 6 years after we started in West Africa with the clinical trials, we got approval with EMA. We still have to do a validation batches, additional clinical trials, and it's like long forgotten. We had the same timeline, which we do now for COVID, to get to a Zika vaccine. Yeah? And you remember the time of Zika, Brazil with the misformed newborns. Do you think that anybody is interested to have a Zika vaccine at this moment? We had to stop the vaccine because there is no interest at all. And Zika can come back anytime in a very so those are things where the attention of the world is only there when it threatens our Western countries effectively. Yeah. But the seeds of many of these viruses are in parts of the world where there is no attention. They could start growing and expanding, and before we know, it's a global problem. So we have to be global citizens, having the conscience, but also the insights and the commitment to not just work when it reaches the US shores, but also work when long before that. Who knows, MERS and Lassa and Nipah and all the different viruses which are around in the world today, they're there. Influenza might be the next one, and it's there. And the big next mutation could be a COVID type epidemic, pandemic again. So I think the approach here is clinical trials, yes, it's new science, yes, but it's a special attention to global health to make sure that we take care of the globe and not just of the regions where we live in.
Yeah, I think that's Cliff, please jump in.
Well, I was just going to add, I think Paul makes a very good point, and that is we need to recognize that there is a certain class of problems. I think global health is one of them, but I would put climate change in that category and maybe even cybersecurity, where we're just not going to solve them inside national borders. We need new strategies, new organizations, new collaborations, and we need the commitment of our leaders to facilitate those kinds of interactions. We're going to have to solve those problems together.
I agree. Michael,
if I could build on, just building on Regina's point, and also ones Cliff and Michelle, you picked up on as well, right? I mean, another lesson from COVID-19 is the effects of underlying health. And again, Black and brown people, being more affected by it. And, our colleagues who published this report, about, prioritizing health. There's a lot that we could do to improve people's healthcare with things that we already need to do. We've got to do all the stuff in the lab that we're talking about now, but things that already exist, could extend global lifespans by a decade. And all of those things would actually improve our resilience in the face of new infectious disease as well. And so we need to figure out how to do that. At the same time, we're doing amazing things in the lab.
Michael, I want to follow up with you. I tried to read your doctoral thesis last night on search engine, which has a fantastic name. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. It's the best thesis title I've seen. But I'm not going to ask you to talk about error analysis using Boolean connectives. But I do want to point out that when you wrote this thesis, Google just sort of was the new kid on the block. The big players with Alta Vista and Lycos and Excite and all these other names that we've all forgotten about. And what it tells us is that the technology isn't just evolutionary sometimes. Sometimes it just leapfrogs. As we've seen, Regina was talking about, the messenger RNA platform and some of the things that we've seen happen now. talk a little bit about how do we find those leapfrogs to help us, Regina just, for example, mentioned using organ systems and tissue systems to sort of, to sidestep, if you will, the old-fashioned way of doing clinical trials. At some point, we're going to need some leapfrog solutions for these big ideas.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Now, that said, as a technologist, I think the closer you look at things, the less they seem like, an amazing breakthrough that one person came up with. And, to use another analogy, Trevor's, it's more like little clades of innovation that happen, and suddenly you have a new strain or something like that. But what do you need to do? Look, you need to invest. I mean, you need to put resources against it, right? And so that's dollars amongst other things. It is, hard resources too. You need talent. And then, I think Michelle picked up on this, one of the other lessons from COVID is the incredible amount of not just, and Cliff, you mentioned it too, not just collaboration across different organizations or companies, but across country borders. And if you just look at the co-author lists on a lot of papers, it's just incredible, right? And it's like the United Nations, only better functioning. Sorry, not a good joke. But in any case, right? I mean, it's this type of collaboration and the sorts of things that are going on literally on social media. If you look at the way that the clinicians were using Twitter to try to understand how do you treat this thing better? Should you put someone on an event or not, right? I mean, people from Italy to the United States and New York, et cetera, just trying to share what's going on. That's all possible because of this information technology. We need more of that. We need to continue doing that. And yeah, there's competition too. That's terrific too, but also being able to enable this type of collaboration is what's going to make it happen. And then, Michelle made comments. I mean, again, we've got to figure out the right balance between safety as well as, speed so that we can get all these things done. I think, folks who are deep into this, folks who've been at FDA, et cetera, know there are places we could speed things up. And then the other thing, it came up a little in the chat, and I hope we'll have more of a discussion about it. None of this stuff happens. When we looked at our research, about 70% of the innovations, and not just in healthcare, but across all of the different areas where bio could make a difference, are already under existing regulatory regimes. Those regulatory regimes are underpinned by the understanding of our citizenry. And unless we can get people to understand the science better, our politicians won't make thoughtful policy, or policymakers, let's say, in some cases it's regulators. And so we need to raise the overall waterline. Not only do we need great scientists and great engineers to do the work on the lab bench and, in the production facilities, we need everybody to understand this a little better so they do make good decisions about, whether or not they should give their children vaccines, for instance.
Cliff, before we move to the knowledge question and science familiarity, I want to just touch on something that Michael said, which is about investment and organizational construct, right? So when we had the space age between 59 and 69 in the US, we devoted 2.2% of all federal spending to our exploration of space. About 80% of that was R&D. We're not at those levels right now. And we could be at those levels. If you look at public-private partnership opportunities, we could be. But it's not only the raw dollars, it's also the formation of programs which have a different risk tolerance and also have a different view on the interdisciplinary nature of the program itself. So we need a good basic science foundation to draw upon, that is clear. But particular programs, very much in the DARPA style that we've talked about, they take on projects with a clear objective at the intersection of science and this kind of use-inspired work. It's often highly interdisciplinary, highly multi-institutional, and it's very important to get done. It's part of what the Wellcome Trust recognized when they formed Wellcome Leap, that we need more of those activities in the life sciences generally to make the kind of advances we need in global health.
Yeah,
can I just add to that as well? It's so important that we talk about how governments can come together and nonprofits can come together to support this work. And we do need better investment in those areas. But we also need to realize as a society that the roles that our companies play in developing these solutions and actually bringing them to a form that patients can use is critically important. Despite the amazing investment we've had in NIH, by some estimates, 90 to 95% of all drugs that come to market through company efforts. And so we need to start talking about not just delivering the health that's available in our medical cabinets today, but we need to talk about health as in terms of innovation as well, so that we're not starving the innovative engine that's needed for the very last mile of driving this great science to the bedside where it can actually help a patient.
Yeah, thank you. These are great points. This is just, I mean, you know, so much to talk about. You know, Michael, I want to actually get to Trevor in just a bit. And then I want to bring in our fantastic audience as well. And one of your colleagues, Michael, Matthias Evers, who I know, you know, who leads your innovation and R&D practice, you know, and we're going to ask him to weigh in a second. But Michael, you mentioned something about the regulatory frameworks. One of the sort of elephants in the room is also that the regulatory apparatus is also built on a very older, outdated vision of biology, in the sense that it's focused on tissues and diseases, for example. And we know that diseases, particularly those that are driven by genetics, you know, often cross those boundaries very, very fluidly. You know, there is a biological pathway that a disease might have that cuts across so many of our traditional regulatory barriers. And so, you know, we have to rethink that as well. Trevor, you know, I don't know if you have tenure yet. So I'm going to ask you to, you know, to just, you know, you might need to be cautious here in your answer, but there are academic barriers as well. I mean, we've talked about some of the needs to sort of come together with industry and across spaces, and you know, without getting yourself fired, can you talk about obstacles that you would like to see overcome to get us to that revolutionary breakthrough?
Yeah, well, to be very pragmatic and just back one step in the conversation as well, thinking about kind of regulatory issues. Early, if we just think early on in the pandemic in February and March, the regulatory stance was basically that thinking about testing, that a false positive is a terrible thing, and we need to avoid a false positive test because it will cause someone to have to be quarantined, et cetera. And that resulted in a lot of stringency in who could test. And there was kind of immediately a small army of academics and lab medicine departments that had gotten PCR up and running for SARS-CoV-2. It's not that hard, and we're able to do testing, but things were heavily restricted to just be the CDC test from CDC labs, and that of course cost us a huge amount of time. And I think the key issue there just being that giving someone a drug is a very different thing than giving someone a test, and that framework could have been a bit different between the two things, and that we could have had a higher tolerance for false positives very early on in the pandemic. Yeah.
Matthias, I would love to get you in here. I've given your introduction here. If you could just wave and have us identify you.
So let me wave. Hi, this is Matthias, and thank you, Clifton, and great to see everyone. A lot of known and a few new faces. I mean, it's really hard to weigh in, Clifton, but thanks for, I mean, let me try three observations, and I anchor that to what Regina said, and a little bit with Michelle's point on the entrepreneurial side of the company innovation, but this Sputnik moment, because I mean, Michael and I, we led this research on the biorevolution, and we are we try to communicate this message. There's really a very strong convergence between the biological science and computing, AI, automation that enables a lot. And I don't think we can even be ambitious enough, because I think what we see on the biology side will help on COVID, but we are thinking, I mean, even engineering biology to stay healthy in the first place, which will preempt, I mean, in a very effective way, some of the what's today more sick care, but also challenges like sustainability and climate. So one of our figures that we communicate is that 60% of biomaterials could be impacted by bioprocesses in a more sustainable way. And so I want to say is, let's have this discussion not only on COVID. Yes, it's a crisis for sure, But in the larger scheme of things, I mean, we have a lot of crises to fight, and there's a real convergence moment. And the challenge I would put up here is a convergence of will, because Regina, you said it, and yes, I do believe it in a way on COVID, but I could now make the challenge point, what about all the cancer patients? They deserve the same urgency. Or sustainability, I mean, it deserves the same urgency. So the question is for me a little bit, how do we utilize this moment and maybe broaden the dialogue? Because I think the tools and the foundation is there now in biology. That's maybe one thought too, but happy to also to comment on other question. But I would just like to add this one impetus here.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I want to get Stan Bergman in here. Stan is the CEO of Henry Schein and was just honored on our Change the World list for some work that your company did, particularly not just in the collaborative effort, but really in anticipating what the challenge would be, for sure. And I think this is a key issue is making sure that we're all thinking about the future, not just thinking about what's right in front of us. But Stan?
Cliff, thank you very much. And of course, the work that is being done in the vaccine area is remarkable. But I'm very, very concerned with the attention of the world drifting from prevention, the whole idea of PPE. At the beginning of the Ebola crisis, we shipped product to West Africa and we contained the crisis. It's terrible what happened, but to quote Regina, we can't solve these matters in our national borders. I think Paul said earlier on, the attention of the world right now is on vaccines. We can't wait for this to come to our shores. These viruses do not carry passports. They don't have visas. It's one world. And I'm very, very worried that we plastered over the whole idea of PPE, of masks, of gloves, but we don't have a global plan. And we're going to forget about this. And the next time there's some emergency, some pandemic, epidemic, pandemic, we're going to start all over again. So vaccines are important, but the basics are also of infection control critical.
Yeah, I think that bringing innovation to the sort of nuts and bolts is important. Beth, I know we've got a number of questions and comments in the chat room. Do you want to sort of read some of those out or call
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm going to go to a couple people. Marjorie Kress put a question in, which I think is a really important one about science and trust. So Marjorie, if you wouldn't mind turning on your microphone and going ahead and asking our panelists.
No, I'm just sitting here in Washington, very concerned that our country has lost confidence in our scientific process for all reasons that we don't have to go into. And I just wondered, as we're all, as people are inventing the future and talking about all these great advancements, whether they're giving thought to concurrent process to win back the trust of the scientific process.
That's a great question. Who wants to jump on that?
Can I jump in there? This is a huge concern for us at Bio, and we've been trying to fight it very proactively. In midsummer, we were facing polling numbers showing that 54% of Americans would be unwilling to take a COVID vaccine if it were available. That slipped to 50, and then about a month ago, it was down to 40. And now one recent poll shows it around 20%. And so we have been really trying to go out there and hit hard that we have to stand up for the scientific integrity of the process and the independence of the process from any political manipulation. Bio put out a letter signed by myself and 5 of our most recent former chairs to this effect. 9 of our vaccine manufacturers came together to put out a vaccine pledge. All of these communications really trying to show to the public that it is in the best interest of patients, our biomedical enterprise, all involved, that the science speaks for itself without manipulation or without filter. And that's critically important. And we just have to keep saying it again and again. And we have to fight anytime we see that slipping.
That's great. Beth?
I want to jump in here too. This is a negative area where the convergence of information technology and biology has hit each other in terms of misinformation. If we didn't have the types of tools that we can use for collaboration, we also wouldn't have the types of tools that are actually used to virally spread misinformation, which is a tremendous problem. And again, one that I don't have a solution for, but as long as we start to recognize it as a problem, we'll need to figure out how to address it. And by we, I mean, the platform players themselves, the ones who, host these types of systems. You could think about public policy as well. And then you could think about, as Michelle and others have been doing, how do you put out the information that's important, the information that's scientifically sound, and get people to understand it, and make good choices, such as, if a safe and effective vaccine is available, to actually use it.
That's great. That's
I think one other thing to think about is whether ordinary people, and especially people who've lost others, or, if there's some storytelling that can go on around this too, to make it more human, because I think most people get bogged down in the science, most of the average people. We did something like this for the UN Foundation a number of years ago called Shot at Life. And it was all about trying to educate through kids, also the parents, about the efficacy of vaccines and how important they are. So I just think we have to give that as much attention in a current time frame as we're giving the vaccines, or we need the convergence of the will and the science in order to make a difference.
That's great.
So yeah, we have another, we've got another question in the chat here. This one from Garen Staglin about mental health and COVID. Garen, if you wouldn't mind turning on your microphone and going ahead and asking your question.
Certainly, thank you. So depression's the #1 illness in the world, and isn't it possible that the mortality and morbidity that's being accelerated by this COVID virus is going to actually cause this to be far greater a pandemic than the pandemic itself, than the COVID pandemic? And if so, doesn't it mandate the kind of innovation, acceleration that we're all seeking here?
So I can comment. So Garen, I appreciate your question. I think that when I think about the path forward and the building to a health age, it's inclusive of efforts on infectious disease control, but it embraces 3 primary axes where I think we need 10x level breakthroughs in innovation. The first is to improve our mechanistic understanding of human health and disease. And here is where I think mental health broadly fits. We still have so little mechanistic understanding of the process of mental health, the phenotypes that evolve, and methods of treatment. We've been studying for decades. We've made very little progress. We need to go deeper. We need to understand the fundamental mechanisms if we're going to have new breakthroughs in mental health. The second category is to transform the economics. We've just got to change the time, cost, and risk profile of developing new interventions. In every field that I've been, if we can shorten the time constant of innovation and reduce the barrier to taking shots, we make progress. Of course, that's fundamental, right? And then the third is, can we get to better speed, scalability, and equity in delivery? And here again, mental health falls into the appropriate category. So I think when we talk about path forward for innovation, when we talk about building a health age going forward, it has to encompass all of those things, not only today's problem.
It's remarkable if you go back and look at organizations like the ones that you led, DARPA, and that you're leading now, Wellcome, LEAP, and BARDA, and others. The power to de-risk is extraordinary in terms of what we've seen in terms of the output of the number of approved medicines, for example. I think you'd have to go back and, I defy you to find a drug company that has that many approvals. But what more can we do to reduce the time cost and the overall cost and to de-risk beyond just the DARPAs and BARDAs of the world? NIH, obviously, there's a $42 billion in federal spending largely for biology, for research on health and medicine. But is that enough? What's the next step?
I think a lot of of breakthrough innovations come from public-private partnerships where industry works productively together with academic environment. Yeah, but like Gan was saying, the depression, the neurosciences are probably the most deprived from innovation at the moment. And I've been in drug and vaccine development for 30 years, and there are typically 2 or 3 different things which make it happen: is mechanistic understanding and biomarkers, which can give an early indication of efficacy and optimization, and then clinical trial insights, or especially endpoints and way to evaluate patients, which accelerate time to result. And we have seen that in HIV, when we had a viral load as an endpoint, suddenly there were 20 antivirals. Yeah, we knew the virus, we knew we had a virus. Oncology, when I started, we had to count deaths in the clinical trials. Then it very quickly moved to different endpoints and very good understanding of the biology, and many cancer drugs came out. So this field of especially neuroscience needs a very special attention of the world to bring a breakthrough in getting to new type of medicines. We're still using the mechanism of actions we had 50 years ago or 30 years ago. No progress.
I agree with that, Paul. I agree with that, Paul. I also think that we need much more focus on preventative care. We need to understand early interventions that affect the entire trajectory of health, right? And we don't, our economic models for that are not good right now. We need early diagnostics. We need early nutritional interventions. I think, Michael, you and the folks at McKinsey spoke eloquently about this. And those are the kinds of efforts where public-private partnerships really matter. It's important for industry, whether you're talking your employee base or your customer base or the health of the community that you do business in. All of those things have to be part of what we think about going forward.
You know, it's a cliche to say we need a, quote, Manhattan Project for X or Y, but do we? I mean, there are a lot of these areas that intersect so many different diseases and pathologies. You mentioned biomarkers as one. Should this be something where we need a joint effort, public, private, academic, multi-government, cross-border effort on establishing biomarkers and early testing for so many of these pathologies?
Well, I personally think some of them will take the form of Manhattan-like projects or moonshots. I don't think all things need fall in that category. I think some may fall, as Paul mentioned, or Michelle talked about, into deep public-private partnerships. I think that's appropriate. Something that most people don't realize is that in 1969, we had 2 major scientific advances. We landed humans on the moon, and the first packet switch message was sent that gave birth to the internet. Now, one of them had a lot of fanfare and publicity, and the other happened quietly between 2 labs and set the course for the information age, right? So we should be mindful that some of these fundamental advances underneath, they change the platform on which we build going forward, in addition to things that look like Manhattan projects or moonshots.
I thought you were going to say the Beatles' Abbey Road, which came out in 1969, but that's all right. I mean,
there is something I want to just mention on there is something, products which go into humans, yeah, where are products which are around the humans, and a product which you deploy injectable or something which gets into the body, it typically takes 20 years to get to a breakthrough. Yeah? And so you can, with science, with data science, you can accelerate to a certain point, but still, it's not the first version which will work. So if we want to get change in a field and we want to have it fast, you have to have a special program to accelerate it. Otherwise, it's not happening. That is, and especially in mental health, there is so little attention at the moment on the global scale on making advances there that something else needs to happen in order to get to breakthroughs.
I'd love to come back in one of the last time, we don't have that much time left, but to the data revolution, which is one of those revolutions that's intersecting technology and biology and medicine. Trevor, as somebody who studies this sort of data and infrastructure, and all of you do to some extent, how do we figure out ways to sort of use our data to get us in better stead going forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'd like to tie that into the Manhattan Project idea, where I think there are at least a couple different kind of almost obvious things we could do to fix the epidemic right now, but just require a huge implementation lift and a lot of money and a lot of people working together. One of those on the data side is test, trace, isolate, where it's really hard to get the kind of army of people to make phone calls to everyone that that tests positive, to get the results turned around in time to actually have that speedy enough that you can kind of get ahead of the unfolding transmission chain. But it's like it's just engineering and political will to make that happen. That totally hasn't happened. Um, and one of the key things there that has hobbled the efforts of state public health departments to do contact tracing and test, trace, isolate is data systems, where everything is based on kind of legacy databases. The historical ways to fight outbreaks is with Excel, where you have kind of line lists of people and you have your messy epi data, but that's not going to work for COVID. And so for just doing the actual test, trace, isolate, it requires a data infrastructure that we don't have in the US with public health across basically every institution. And this manifests in just how difficult it is to actually start pulling things together, where you want to kind of integrate your EMR data with your phone call that you've made to the person, your case investigation with their pathogen genome, and it's like very hard to actually get that all into one place. It requires just a huge amount of attention there. And so this is something that generally is, I see as incredibly lacking with public health in the US. And it's also stopped us from understanding things in real time, like how much are restaurants versus bars versus schools, et cetera, contributing to spread. And we should know that every week, but we don't because of this data issue.
This has been an extraordinary and sprawling and complex conversation. I want to do my best to try to summarize some key takeaways here. One, this was mentioned quite a bit. We need to rebuild trust. We need to rebuild trust in our conveyors of scientific and medical information, which is so fundamental. And I know that all of you are doing that on a day-to-day basis. Two, these are global challenges in many cases, and they require global partnerships and global solutions. And we have to be mindful of that as we move forward. Three is we need systems to de-risk some of the sort of areas in which there is either pre-competitive science or ways in which we can take shared knowledge and use that to build up our competitive pursuits. But that's a key thing, and obviously groups like Wellcome, Leap, and others do that, and we really greatly appreciate that. Four is that we need to invest in these data systems, as Trevor said, and replace the legacy data systems that are so broken to get us real-time information that we can actually act on. You know, five is that this is our Sputnik moment, as Regina said. And, you know, a great crisis is a terrible thing to waste, and we can't let us waste this one. This is a chance for us all having these conversations and to think broadly and ambitiously about where we can move from here. And finally, I think this was also well said by Regina, but many others touched on it, which is this is a moment for a convergence of will. We have it now. We've seen it. We've seen it with these extraordinary collaborations that Michelle mentioned through in the biopharma space and others. And this is our chance to sort of really capitalize on that. So with that, I want to thank Michael and Trevor and Michelle and Regina and Paul. You were spectacular panelists, and it's over to you, Beth.
Thanks, Cliff, and thank you again to our panelists, and thank you to our audience for joining us for this conversation today about how innovation can drive revolution in healthcare. We're so glad to have you as part of our Brainstorm Health community, and hope to see you all again soon. Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.